Hi, and welcome to the presentation FME Governance, How to Structure the Use and Growth of Your FME Environment. My name is Leslie McKenzie. I'm Director of Innovation, Technology, and Strategy at Concert Tech Solutions, and I will be giving you this presentation today. The objective of today's presentation is seeing FME as an enterprise application, and really what are those considerations and questions that you ask yourself when you're planning the implementation of FME Server in an organization. And this can be a small FME server or it could be a large FME server. The idea, the message I want to pass today is that you really have to learn how to evolve and scale to the needs. This is a quote that I really like. There is enough room in the sandbox for all the castles, but we have to agree on how to share the sand. The idea being that we'll touch a lot of points on governance and how to sort of agree to all use the FME server and how to sort of, manage our content. So today's agenda, I'm going to start with an introduction. What are the challenges? What are the benefits of governance? What are the elements of a plan for governance and implementation? And what are the different questions and considerations? So a short history. I've been working with FME since 2005, and I've been working with FME Server since I believe it's 2008. Been installing it for a long time, been helping organizations implement it, small organizations, large organizations. And in the early years of FME, FME sort of grew organically in a lot of organizations. So what does that mean? We started by doing a few things. Those few things caught on, and they had some successes. Then they added more things and more things and more things. So there wasn't really a methodology for how to use FME. It just kind of got used where it was best, solving a problem. So it kind of grew organically and heroically in a way. And it tended to be managed by only a few individuals. Okay, so normally we wouldn't even have a whole department using it. We would have like a couple of people in a GIS department who are using FME. And FME Server then would get adopted by those who had been using FME Desktop for a long time and just needed more. And so then they would get FME Server. So, FME Server adoption tended to be by organizations who had been using FME for a long time. And like I said, there tended to be a little organization of content in those early years, either using desktop or server. What did this lead to? Several organizational challenges. So for those who already had FME and let it kind of grow organically, we tended to see some quality control issues. So, you ended up with sort of content named all kinds of things. Duplicate processes, so the same FME workspace more than one time with slight different variations and different things people were testing, but they can't remember what they were. And I've more than one time, I've many times sat down with somebody and literally had to go through all of their content and try to decipher, which content was still good, which which workspaces were being called by schedules, which maybe publications, which subscribers and the notification service were maybe orphaned or were still getting utilized. And the processes themselves sometimes were difficult to read because they were sort of developed, in an ad hoc way, sort of any which way, which did the job at the beginning. But later on, when you have like 5 workspaces, it's one thing. When you have like 300 workspaces, it's not the same thing anymore. The other thing, challenge staff turnover. So, FME Server has now been around long enough that there's likely been staff turnover. This is a normal thing. And, so the people managing these processes are not the people who originally wrote them or implemented them. Inefficient scheduling and engine management, this is due to different reasons. Sort of like when you have, the whole FME server wide open and available to you, you sort of like spread the schedules out and kind of any which way. And sometimes leaving medium-sized gaps between schedules, but this also limits what you can fit between 2 schedules. And some of it was also because there weren't as many options for prioritization and job chaining as there is now in FME Server. So some people would run one workspace at 1 a.m. and then run the next one at 1:15 just to be 100% sure that workspace 1 completed at 1 a.m. before workspace 2 started, but that would leave a weird processing gap. And then you had to be trying to fit different workspaces between these different gaps. And so it became a little bit more cumbersome and complex to do that when there's a lot of them. Permissions and security were not things that were greatly looked at the beginning. So these became increasingly issues, and then migration becomes increasingly challenging. When you don't really know what your FME server is doing, it's hard to predict what impact migration might have. The other thing is some organizations, had larger, more complex FME servers now, so it becomes more complex to migrate, and there's more considerations to take into account, more people using it. Now we need a migration plan. We need to go to production plan. We need to know how we're going to do it. Even if it's not a huge endeavor, it still needs some organization. The other challenges that we're seeing is new organizations adopting FME server faster. Automation is becoming more important as a general topic. Organizations have more and more, data to manage, but the staff is not growing proportionately to the data. So, you have to do more things automatically and efficiently. So FME is now getting leveraged across an organization as well. So not just one or two people in a GIS department, but maybe different people in different departments with different needs and different priorities, and different permissions to data. We're seeing these newer organizations onboard FME Server at a much faster rate because of that need for automation, which means they're uptaking both FME Desktop and Server at the same time, which requires a little bit more planning than when you've been using FME Desktop for 10 years and then you finally onboard to FME Server. You've mastered FME Desktop. You got to learn both now. We also look at there's way more deployment options available now. So there's FME Cloud or FME Server. FME Server could be a containerized version. It could be installed in the cloud. It could be installed on premise on a VM. There's, now that there's more options, we need to think about matching those options to our needs. So the solution to this is, instead of just sort of installing an FME server really quickly and then trying to figure out what it is, we try to approach FME server from an implementation and governance point of view. So what are the main components of a governance and implementation plan? I would say we sort of divide the three main elements into like technology and people and standards. I put security on the side because security will impact the technology, security will impact the people, and security will impact the standards as well. It'll impact how we use the tool. So all these three things together are really important to get off on the right foot in using my FME server. This is just a different look at the same information where I sort of included also, technology versus IT practices. So, we want to install and configure the technology, but IT practices influence that. And then the most important thing here is also the business needs component, which is why it's sort of separated from the rest of the pie. The business needs are going to drive a lot of what we do technologically, how we, it's going to drive, how we interact with the IT practices. It's going to drive the people. It's going to drive the standards. It's going to drive the security as well. So all these things tend to impact each other, though, in some way. So they're all sort of the facets we need to consider when we're implementing our FME server. So the main question I've learned to ask when approaching somebody who's going to install their first FME server is, what are you planning on to do with it in the next 6 to 12 months. So I've picked 6 to 12 as an example, but it could be the next 24 months. I would say that the average clients are upgrading in the two-year range. Some upgrade every year, some upgrade every 3. I've got a couple that do every 4 years, but the bigger the delta, the more risky the migration becomes, because we actually end up having to analyze the differences between the two versions and sort of predict what's going to happen. So I would say like the sweet spot is maybe in the 2-year range, But, often with the first FME server and often for sort of the sake of sanity, it's easier to predict what we're going to do in the next 6 to 12 months and then keep re-asking ourselves that question. And I tell people, write them out literally, prioritize the projects, and look at this as a living document. It's not set in stone. Priorities change, needs change, technologies change, applications change. So we need to learn to keep re-asking ourselves these questions so that we can adapt appropriately. Again, what we're going to do with the FME server, that's what's going to drive how much licensing we need to buy. How much processing are we going to do? That's going to impact how many engines I need and what kind of engines I need. Dynamic engines, regular engines. Where's my FME server going to live? Do I need to buy cloud infrastructure? How to architect the application. Is it going to be a complex application? Is it going to be a simple application? You still need to ask these questions when you have a simple application, because even though your first FME server might be a very simple one, if you get into the habit of asking these questions, it will become much easier to scale up later when you need to. And then it will impact, these other facets like how we're going to install and configure. So the key message here is really the business needs are going to drive how we're going to use the FME server, and that's really going to drive a lot of the rest of the implementation. So when we look at the technical part of the governance plan, the technology part, I usually tell people to make an integrations roadmap. So what do I put in my integrations roadmap? Again, what projects I want to do. Then we try to identify what kinds of integrations we're going to do. Scheduled tasks tend to be easy to predict. So it helps us predict the busyness of our server, the priorities of the processes, on-demand processes, apps, automation. We try to get an idea of what we're going to do with the FME server. And then I just threw a pro tip in here. You need to make a hypothesis sometimes. Sometimes it's pretty easy because all the projects are pretty laid out and we're able to get a pretty clear idea of what we're going to be doing. But sometimes it's a little bit less clear. It's more about implementing a platform, but we can still make certain hypotheses a lot of the time, and you've got to go with something at the end because you got to size your server. So you have to make a theory and then adapt it. Step 2, in the integration plan, prioritizing the projects, we tend to ask a lot of questions like, are the workspaces ready? Do they already exist? Or is this something new that's going to have to be developed? This helps with the timeline. Do we know is the data ready that we're going to need to process? Sometimes it's not. These things help us in identifying project priorities. But the really key thing that I want to pull out of this is it also answers the question, what data and systems are we connecting to? And this is very important. That will drive a lot of the IT considerations in the implementation of the FME server, because this will tell us, in terms of networking, permissions, access, database accounts, web services, this will drive a lot of the configuration and setup of the FME server. So in the facets of governance and implementation, so if we start with that technology piece, now that we know what we're going to do with the FME server, so step 1 is, what are we going to do with the FME server? For a very simple install, this is like an 8-question questionnaire that we go through. And again, we list the projects, prioritize, talk about the systems, the types of automations. Now that we have that information, we can, look at the licensing or, how many engines. We can look at the hardware specs. What do we need to provision for those engines, especially what kind of memory, CPU? Because if I'm going to run a lot of little teeny weeny JSON-based processes that are connecting 2 web applications together, a lot of memory might not make a lot of difference in that kind of process. Maybe having a faster CPU will, but having a lot of memory won't. However, if I'm doing, a few processes, but the really large raster integrations or point cloud processing, or a lot of spatial overlays or spatial comparisons or joining operations, maybe memory will make a big difference. So these things, one FME server is not sized like another, and they really need to be sort of tuned tuned to the needs. Otherwise, you end up with, what I've literally seen where people have, a happy FME server running along for a few years, processing general town-sized, vector data, and then somebody decides to unpack a terabyte worth of imagery on it, and not thinking that the machine was not actually, provisioned to be able to process that. So these are the things that become really important in this case. Architecture, fault tolerance, do we need it? Do we not? We tend to do a risk, at this point, we do a sort of a risk exercise, a risk management exercise, like what happens if the processes are not going to run? Do we need to have fault tolerance? What is the time delay for the level of service that we need to offer for this application? Do we need a distributed model? Do we need options for scalability? So a very simple one machine FME server might do the job at the beginning, but are we planning to scale it up by a lot? Do we have our options planned and ready for scalability? Do we need to consider that we might end up adding a machine with engines, or different kinds of scenarios like this. So we sort of go through this exercise. Again, this exercise can be very small if we're talking about a very simple little FME server, or it could be a little bit bigger if we're talking about a more complex system. The technology, again, we plan how we're going to install the FME server, how we're going to architect it, but we also need to think about how we're going to configure it. So how we're going to configure it, that's going to be about web services. Are there specific network requirements? Are we going to configure it with HTTPS? Are there special software dependencies? This is a very important question, because whatever your FME desktop needs to run its processes, FME server will also need. So if you have special Python interpreters, if you're using something like R, if you're using special database clients, you will need to make sure that you provision your FME server with anything that the workspaces are going to need to be able to run. So we usually like to make, again, by knowing what we're going to do with the FME server, we can provision most of it. It doesn't mean that things won't change or that there won't be extra considerations, but it means that, if we can cover the most of the needs, then we're not at day one trying to figure out why our FME workspaces are not running on FME server. The next consideration that I think is really important is the people, and I think this one's been a little bit overlooked. So people are the ones that operate and manage the FME server. So we've done a few exercises now with different clients to identify what are the different roles and responsibilities in terms of using the FME server, who's responsible for what, and what kind of skills are required to operate those roles and responsibilities. So what is the uptraining plan? And this is to provision for that idea that staff may turn over. We may start including other staff in other departments on FME at using FME server, and we sort of need to know what the skills necessary are to work with that. So this is sort of an example of, a required competencies table developed that's sort of, itemizing, and this is not the full table, but it's itemizing a little bit of the difference between, the FME admin versus the FME author or developer role. So a lot of the core roles tend to fall under, like, the user roles, which only an executor, the FME author role, which is a content creator and manager, and then the FME admin, which is a system manager. But sometimes in some organizations, we've also had a few additional roles that we've put in. So like, let's say an FME desktop only creator, so creates only FME workspaces for desktop, versus somebody who has the author skills and even a sort of a solutions architect role. So it's not like we call them an FME architect role, and this person's role is more to figure out how the automation structure is going to work. So, we've done an exercise of itemizing a little bit more of these roles sometimes. And then we come to the standards. So we already saw the sort of the technology part, and then we've seen what we do to, around the people, and then there's sort of the implementation of standards and practices. So standards and practices, what we're looking at for that, management practices, development guide, and style and naming convention. So here we see in the style guide, we're often in the visuals. We're trying to create a visual impact that it's consistent and easy to use. This makes our workspaces easier to maintain over time. So it's that little investment at the beginning that has greater impact down the line when you're trying to understand what maybe 100 workspaces are doing or 200 workspaces are doing. So, it's also about establishing how much annotation and good practices for the group. Also, naming conventions. Desktop users don't tend to do a lot of implementation of naming conventions because they tend to open the workspace and run it a lot of the time. So they sort of know that GeoDatabase 1, GeoDatabase 2, and GeoDatabase 3, what they're pointing to. But if you erase the paths and have all empty paths and it just says source dataset Excel, source dataset OGC, like you see here in this graphic on the right, it can get confusing for somebody to know exactly what to feed the workspace in order for it to run properly if this thing is on FME Server. So here I just put a nice example of when I pulled from the samples data set where you're seeing everything's written out nicely so that both the person seeing the prompts can understand, but even the published parameter itself has a easy to understand name. We also establish naming conventions around the content on FME Server. And this has an impact because repositories are related to the security of the items. So, how we divide up the repositories, is it by group and project? So we tend to make a nomenclature. So maybe it's going to be like group _project. We also get into the notion of who is the owner of the content. Because the owner, because if we're a group working with workspaces, we want to know whether or not we want there to be a group owner whose responsibility, again, is the workspace. Then we have the development practices, and this is sort of around the shared content, the versioning, but the one I really want to point out here is really about the move to production. How do we get a process into production? On a very simple little FME server, this might be as simple as, well, republish the process with under a different name and like point to the production database. It can be as simple as that. Or you might have a dev, QA, and production environment, and it should be a known methodology of how to move your workspaces through those different environments. Are you using projects? Some of my clients use projects to package up the content and move it from one FME server to another. But, do you have to change certain things like database names? Are you going to use scripting? We've seen different strategies for the idea of move to production. And then there's the management practices. So I think it's really important to consider the idea that the FME server is not just this thing that you install once and like walk away from. It's a thing you have to manage and provision for and plan. Again, when we have a very simple FME server, something like the contingency plan, might be as simple as, hey, if it goes out for a day, we're okay. But by being used to doing the risk management, looking at the processes, what happens if there's an unplanned interruption of services? What happens if a certain workspace fails? What happens if there's a planned outage? How are those handled with IT? Who alerts who and who's responsible for making sure the FME server came back up? All these sorts of considerations should be planned for. And that way, as the FME server grows, we're able to plan for it better. We're sort of already in the practice of planning for this. I do want to point out that in the last year or so, SAFE has been adding a lot of like statistics, the amount of CPU time, the average running time for workspaces, the number of times the schedules have run. These things are very handy in that day-to-day tracking of the performance of the FME server. So whoever's responsibility is that. And the management plan should also include a method for prioritization. So if I have a limited number of engines and I have 5 groups using the FME server, somebody wants to run a job every 1 minute, do they get a dedicated engine? Like who decides that? We have to decide those things and we have to make a plan. And again, I'm really pro the idea of growing the need to the business needs and then evolving it as we need to. Because the needs will change over time. Security considerations, we're looking at user security, application security, and data security. So in the user security, we're looking at really considering on the authors here. Like this is where I want to point out that you may need more than one author role if your FME server is serving different groups of users. And this is because authors can create and manage content. So if you give them access to all the content, then they have access to all the data. So if you're, using depending on how you're using FME Server and how you do security in your organization, you do need to consider that. You should have a plan on how to add and revoke user privileges if you need to, and please do not lose the super user's password. Please keep it somewhere safe. You don't know how many people have actually come to me because they've locked themselves somehow out of their FME server. Application security, there are lots of options. I reread the FME Server Administrator's Guide every year to see what's new and different in the security recommendations, the security settings. So there's some settings that are interesting for encryption, HTTPS, and review. It's important to keep reviewing these options because they do evolve over time. Then the last thing I want to say is data security. You have to match your user practices and your user security to the security of your data. That's important. The things, they all have to line up because you don't want to create a security gap in how you're managing your data. So the key takeaways: business needs are the main driver for how you're going to manage your FME server, how you're going to size it, how complex your plan is going to be. Make an integration roadmap. Know what you plan to do with the FME server. It's a living document. So what you can do is you can keep adding to it or reprioritizing as you need, but it'll give you an idea of where you're going and the three main facets of governance. So with that information, with your roadmap, with your business needs, you'll be able to match your technology and your people and your standards to the right practices. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and thank you for listening.